All right, great, guys. Well, thank you so much for coming to my panel. I really appreciate it. I want to talk about video game history from my personal point of view. Now, you can talk about, you can read Wikipedia or read a video game history book or just look up some different things about video game history, and that's all great. But I want to approach this just from a little bit different angle. I want to talk about video game history as I observed it growing up. Now, first of all, thanks all of you for watching the panel. I really appreciate it. I miss the heck out of video game conventions. I was supposed to do so many this year, as I do every year, and I was going to go all over the country. And we have actually gotten to the point where we work our family vacations sometimes into video game conventions. We'll go to the convention for a day or two. I'll do my panel, have my booth set up and everything, and we'll see the sights. We'll stay a day before or after, and just have these awesome vacations. And I miss all you guys. I miss, just hanging out after the shows at night, maybe at the hotel bar, or just talking to you guys, at the booth and signing books and all that stuff. I miss it greatly. Currently, my latest project, my forthcoming project, later this year. This is the cover, the NES Omnibus Volume 1. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that. Currently, I've extended pre-orders for the NES Omnibus Volume 1 on Indiegogo, just indiegogo.com, NES Omnibus. All right, so let's go back to 1975. That's my first recollection of actually seeing a video game, an actual video game. I distinctly remember Pong and Gunfight because these were two-player games that were very interesting to me, and I was impressed by them, but I wasn't completely mind blown because I had already been playing pinball and electromechanical machines years prior, bowling alleys, skating rinks, and places like that. You would see them around, maybe the occasional pizza place. But I distinctly remember Pong and Gunfight being different, but they didn't completely blow my mind, which I'll get to in just a bit, what did blow my mind. But, if you've played Gunfight, it's like Outlaw on the Atari 2600. Outlaw is basically an unauthorized port of Gunfight, just a couple of stick figures in the Old West shooting at each other, and it was a great game. And that sort of predated, Mortal Kombat and Combat for the 2600 games where it's mano a mano. It's just you against the other person, and you're battling it out on the screen. Gunfight led to what, was one of the earliest examples of that kind of game where you're just battling each other on the screen, maybe the first, in fact. And what did blow my mind was later in 1975, we went over to my cousin's house after Christmas, and he told me and my brother, he said, "Hey, come check out what I got for Christmas. It's in my bedroom." And so we go back there, not really knowing what to expect, but he seemed pretty excited. And there, hooked up to his little black and white TV, was Pong, Atari Pong, the home version, this little console Atari Pong that you could play on your home TV set. This blew my brother and my mind. We could not believe what we were seeing. We had no idea that you could play a video game in somebody's house, because before this, we had played in the arcades. We didn't know about the Magnavox Odyssey, the original Ralph Baer creation from 1972. We didn't know about that. We never saw the commercials. None of our friends had a Magnavox Odyssey. So when my cousin had Pong, holy cow, what is this? He could be in his bedroom playing video games. That blew our minds. It was just amazing. And so we played that all weekend, and it was so much fun. And this was my cousin Dana, and he was the kind of guy whose mom would pretty much buy him anything. Now, they weren't rich by any means. They had this little frame house with a velvet Elvis on the wall, and they had really interesting decor, like a retail rack of records with Elvis Presley records on it, one of those retail racks that's like a spinner, and it's a pole that goes from floor to ceiling. It was early poverty was basically the decor. It was a really cool house. I loved it. It was super fun, and it seemed like they always had the newest, coolest toys, even though they probably couldn't afford it. But they did have Atari Pong, and that was absolutely amazing. And so that was 75, and then into 76, my two very best friends just so happened to get a Fairchild Channel F console. That was originally called the Fairchild VES, Video Entertainment System, and I remember playing, Pong-like games on there, and gunfight, sort of get target shooting games, and some things like that. Pretty rudimentary, but we loved it, and it was so cool. that you could actually play, original cartridges on there. You could swap out cartridges instead of just playing built-in games. So the Fairchild Channel F was really awesome. And I remember the version one of my friends had, Troy, the sound actually came out of the console instead of out of the TV itself, which it didn't sound as good. It was kind of an unnecessary expense for the console manufacturer to have a speaker in the console. Well, they figured out that with a later iteration of the Fairchild, you could have the sound coming out of the TV, which made more sense, which sounded better, and saved the manufacturer money. So that was 1976, playing Fairchild Channel F at my two best friends' house. One of them lived right next door to me, and one lived down the road. And at this time, 76 is the same year Mattel Auto Race came out, the handheld system, with the little red hash marks as your cars and stuff. And then in 1977, a bunch of my friends started getting Atari 2600 consoles. This was when the Atari was released. It was the same year Star Wars came out. I was 10 years old in 1977, the perfect age for Atari. And I was super jealous of my friends that got the Atari. And I remember going over to play games like Combat and Air Sea Battle. These were, again, great two-player games. And we had a ton of fun playing these games. I would ride my bike all over town to anybody who had an Atari 2600 at their house. We talked about it at school, and then I would go over to their house and play Atari. And when the Atari debuted, it was $250, which back then was probably, $700 or $800 or something, if you adjust for inflation. That was way too expensive at our house for Christmas maxed out at $100. My parents, Santa Claus wouldn't spend, a penny over $100 for anything for Christmas. And so an Atari 2600, even if my brother and I would have combined $250 and then plus some games and tax and everything, no way. So it was out of the question. And so I didn't have a console at the time, but I played a ton of Atari just going to my friends' houses all the time. And then in 1979, the Intellivision was test marketed, and I probably didn't know about it until 1980 when it went nationwide, and a bunch of friends started getting Intellivisions. And I liked it at first, okay. I liked the Atari 2600 better because I liked the action games and the arcade games. I was more of a pick up and play kind of guy than someone who wanted to, play elaborate sports simulations or, games where you had to read the manual or whatever. I would rather just pick up and play a game and just immediately start shooting or gobbling dots in a maze or whatever, or climbing, ladders or whatever, those kind of rudimentarily early games that were just so much fun. But I did like the Intellivision. I was intrigued by it. And there was, in 1981, this girl I was going out with, I was 14 at the time, and she was 16 and had her own car, which was awesome. And so this was great. But what was even better than her having her own car was she had an Intellivision, which was great. And then a little after that, I played Intellivision. I discovered Astro Smash. This guy I knew had Astro Smash. And that's what really made me a big fan of the Intellivision, the fact that you could play shooters on there. So, the Intellivision was sort of known as kind of a stodgier, more, it's right there in the title, Intellivision for intelligent, kind of for older gamers or more sophisticated gamers or whatever. But I preferred the Atari for a long time, and probably still to this day. But I love both systems. But when I discovered games like, Astro Smash, and then later Beauty and the Beast and Night Stalker and all these great arcade-like games, love me some Intellivision as well. But I still didn't have my own console. In 1979, 1980, around that time, my cousin Marty in Arkansas got an Odyssey 2. Now, this was interesting. This was kind of an exotic console, with the keyboard that wasn't actual individual, keyboards. It was just like a membrane or just like a solid, like plastic. But it did have a keyboard, and it was supposed to be, like more advanced than the Atari 2600 because you could type and all that kind of stuff. But we played the heck out of baseball on that system. And I like that game even more than Home Run for the 2600, just because that's the one me and my cousin Marty spent hours and hours playing. But still, I did not have my own game console. So I had to be a pest, riding my bike to, all my friends' house. Anytime we go to my cousin's house, what game system do you have? Hey, Jeffrey Wittenhagen. Hey, Dan. Hey, Voltaire. Michael, everybody else. I really appreciate you guys watching. This is kind of a fun trip through memory lane. Just growing up, always being surrounded by video games and just different ways to play them, even though we couldn't afford them. I did have a lot of the handheld consoles, like I mentioned earlier, We got Mattel basketball, football, baseball, and then some of the Coleco handhelds and a bunch of those because they were $30 each, and that would fit within our $100 Christmas budget. And I could even get one for my birthday because it was $30. But I still didn't have a console yet of my own, which I'll get to in just a little bit. So we would go, we couldn't afford consoles ourselves. And, I'd go to my friends' houses, cousin houses. We had the handhelds. But then the arcades, when my brother got a car when he was 16 and I was 11, we would go to the mall. We would go to Malibu Grand Prix. We'd go to Land of Oz arcade at the mall, Aladdin's Castle at the mall. And wow, this was just a wonderland of awesomeness, sort of a speakeasy for teens and preteens. Just a great, great, awesome place to hang out. And, but again, we didn't have much money. We would go to the arcades with maybe 50 cents a piece in our pockets, or maybe a couple of bucks between us or whatever, but we managed to play games. We would search the coin slots and pinball machines and video games, and arcade games, just looking for, we'd push that button, and a lot of, quarters or tokens would get stuck in machines, and we would find them that way. Sometimes we would find them on the floor. We would find credits on games from time to time. In a busy arcade, you could just randomly find credits because sometimes maybe a little kid might put a token in a machine and just walk away, or someone, popped a game on a pinball machine and didn't know it. As many of you know, on pinball, you can match, like when your game is over, and these 2 digits will pop up on the back glass. And if those 2 digits match the 2 digit at the end of your score, you would pop a free game. Well, a lot of little kids and parents and just casual players did not know that pinballs you would pop free games just by matching. And some people didn't even know when they would want a free game when it would pop. And people would just walk away occasionally from their pinball. So we would be at the arcades for hours, and we would just kind of hang out and looking for free games. And occasionally from time to time, we might just ask if the arcade operator, they might feel sorry for us. They might just give us a token because we're just these rugrats, hanging around with no money. But we ended up playing a ton of games. And one way we did it, we got really, really good at pinball. My brother and I both could pop games. We got really good at Dolly Parton, at Firepower, and a couple of other machines. And we could just, Hot Hand was one of them, kind of a playing card-based pinball machine. And we got so good at those games that we would pop extra games, and they would sell those off 2 for $0.25 to be able to play video games. Because arcade video games, you might last a minute or two on those, whereas pinball we could play for a long time on $0.25 because we got so good at it. We sort of became pinball hustlers or pinball wizards or whatever, where we would sell our extra games or make little side bets and just destroy people at pinball. But we had to be really creative on ways to be able to play arcade games with no money. And one scheme we figured out one time at the Land of Oz at Northeast Mall, this was 81, 82, we figured out a way to get a whole bunch of tokens or extra money for free. So the Land of Oz ran a special where you would get 4 extra tokens if you spent $5. So just instead of 20 tokens, you'd get 24, if I'm doing my math right. And so we would scrape together $5, and we would put that machine, get our 24 tokens, and when people would walk up to the machine with a $1 bill, we would sell them for those tokens. So once we sold $5 worth, we would have extra 4 tokens. So we would do that. Anyway, we played a ton of arcade games without any money, so that we just had to be creative. Well, then finally, in the summer of 1982, this is what changed everything for me. This is when I saw the awesome ColecoVision commercials. I don't know if you guys remember. They're standing at this arcade machine, and 3D images are flying out of the arcade machine. And even when I was 15, I knew this was hyperbole. But then they show an actual living room TV and everything with Donkey Kong screenshots, gameplay in action, Donkey Kong on a television set. And I could not believe how much it looked like the arcade version. In my eyes, it was identical. It was awesome. It just looked amazing. And I thought, okay, enough of going over to friends' houses to play video games, enough of begging at the arcades and all that. I need this ColecoVision system. This is incredible. And then as I heard more about it through the summer, about, just all these incredible arcade ports for it, what a great system it was, and how you could bring the arcade experience home. I could not imagine just having that at my fingertips anytime in my own house, a game console. I thought, I've got to get this no matter what. And so I mowed yards and I did all this stuff and I scraped together around $100. And I made a deal with my parents. Hey, if I give you this $100, can you give me a ColecoVision for Christmas? Which they did. And I got Mousetrap as well. And Donkey Kong, of course, came packaged with the ColecoVision console. And so that Christmas, all night long, I stayed up. It was the most incredible Christmas of my life. 15 years old, unwrapping a brand new ColecoVision with Donkey Kong and then also Mousetrap. I played those games all night long, just getting really good at Donkey Kong and I loved Mousetrap because it's got these little, prizes that you get, sort of like the fruits in Pac-Man, but they're stationary on Mousetrap. But with every screen you finish, a different prize appears in a different part of the maze. So you felt a sense of progression because what prize is going to be next, and it was awesome. I sat up all night long on my beanbag chair playing that, and I had the worst crick in my neck playing that. ColecoVision, but it's still to this day, it's still other than like my kids being little and stuff when they were little getting their stuff, but it's still a very special Christmas to me, one of the best of all time. And so then let's advance a little bit. So I had the ColecoVision, and then some of my friends had the Atari 5200, but a lot of them had ColecoVision, and we would swap out games, and so that was awesome until the great video game crash. But at that point, it even got better because we didn't know there was a market crash. We didn't think of it in terms of industry. We just thought of it in our own little world in a little suburb of Fort Worth, Texas, that suddenly games got a lot cheaper in 1983. And the first I knew about this was I saw an ad in the paper. Back then, I read the newspaper, before the internet and all this stuff. I read the newspaper a lot, just for not only for news, just what was going on in the world, but for pop culture stuff, because there would be movie reviews, and yes, there were video game reviews. Every Saturday, our Fort Worth Star Telegram paper, which I eventually ended up writing for, which would have amazed my young, teenage self. There were, they had video game reviews in the paper on Saturday, and I loved the Sunday paper because there were video game ads, and I would always look for, if anything was on sale. And I remember the first game I ever bought that was below retail was War Room for the ColecoVision. It was $23, and I rushed out to Sears to get it because it was a whole $7 cheaper than any other ColecoVision game. Most of them were $30. Zaxxon and Miner 2049 were $50, but most ColecoVision games were $30 when I saw War Room for $23. But that predated the crash. That was before it. That was just a normal sale, and that was a great game. But a little later, I saw an ad. I can't even remember what store it was for, but they had Atari 2600 games for $9.99 up to $14.99, and they had them all over this one big page. And I was like, wow, because Atari 2600 games, 25, 30, 35, even 45, $46. I remember distinctly Missile Command and Asteroids being upwards of $46. Phoenix, all those games were expensive, and I remember it was. I was like, wow, this is interesting. I don't know what's going on. I didn't really think of it in industry terms. I just thought there's some cheap games, so I picked up a couple or whatever, and I had gotten an Atari 2600 in 1983 from a friend who had from high school, because when the 5200 and ColecoVision came out, suddenly the Atari 2600 was considered uncool. And so this friend of mine, he just wanted to dump his 2600 because he had progressed to the next generation of consoles. So I got a 2600 and 10 games for $10. He brought that to school. And I remember lugging that around in a box from class to class all day because he sold it to me at school for $10. So suddenly I had a 2600 and a ColecoVision, and I just started getting consoles and games like crazy at that point. But anyway, back to the crash. I saw that ad. Well, not long after that, so when I'm 16, so in 83, I turned 16. I've got a car. 2 days after my 16th birthday, I get a job at a barbecue restaurant, and suddenly I have money for the first time in my life. I have a lot of money because I'm working a lot of hours, like 30-something hours a week in high school, which maybe not have been the best decision of my life, but still, it gave me a lot of money to play games. Well, I was going from store to store, like KB Toys, Circus World, Toys R Us, and they suddenly had these giant bins just filled with video games. Yeah, Luther's Barbecue, great. It was a great job, Michael. Thank you for that. But I would smell horrible at the end of the shift, like barbecue and onions. It was awful. But it was an intense job. And I was actually made supervisor there about 4 or 5 months after I started working there. I started at $3.35 an hour, which was minimum wage back then. And about 4 to 6 months after I started working there, I was promoted to supervisor because I guess I did a really good job, worked hard or whatever, got employed the month and all that. And I became a supervisor, a red shirt. I didn't, luckily I wasn't killed like a Star Trek character, but they promoted me in my from 335 to 550 an hour and gave me a red shirt instead of a green shirt. So I had a lot of money, plenty of money to buy games. But when I started seeing these big tubs, these giant bins out front, um, of ColecoVision and television, Atari 2600, $4.99 each. And wow, this was incredible. So I bought a ton of third-party ColecoVision games that I had passed up, when they were new and 30 or 40 bucks. Just a bunch of stuff for ColecoVision, Atari, and television, all this great stuff for $5. Well, then I would go back to the store over the next few weeks. $3.99, $2.99, all the way down to 99 cents. And consoles were being dumped at this time as well. Vectrex systems, Odyssey 2s, Microvision, and just all these game consoles, stacks of them they were just dumping them like crazy with a great video game crash. There were just too many, too much shovelware for the Atari 2600. That was the key instigator of the video game crash. Computers were getting more popular, and a bunch of factors led to it. It wasn't solely the fault of ET for the 2600 like a lot of people think, but that was a minor factor. But there were a lot of factors involved. Mostly, it was just tons and tons of crap games being produced for the Atari 2600. And like I said, computers were getting popular. There were other factors. But at the time, like I said, I wasn't thinking in terms of industry. I was just thinking in terms of all the awesome games my friends and I, and some not so awesome, like Tomark the Barbarian for the ColecoVision. I think I got that for $2.99. Awful game, but I kept it. It's in my collection. I still have it. So by the late 80s, or let me put it this way, by 86, 87, I already had tons and tons of games because I was buying all this stuff up, uh, from the crash. And so I was a game collector and had this mass thing before that was cool, whatever. So, and so I was going along. I had, Odyssey 2 and television, ColecoVision, and Atari 2600 and all this stuff connected in my room and, hooked up to my TV set. I'd originally started with my ColecoVision in the living room. Well, then when I got my job and everything, I got a TV set and put it in my bedroom, and it was like 250 bucks for a little 19-inch color TV. TVs were very expensive back then, and but I put that in my bedroom, and that was really cool. I had this awesome game collection. And so when the NES came out, when it was test marketed in 1985, and then released nationwide in 1986, I didn't pick up one right away. I didn't think I needed it. Now, I'd heard it was cool and everything, and I didn't actually play it at that time in 86 because by then I was 19, and then in 87 I turned 20. When I was hanging out with my friends, I was no longer going over to their house. We were, going out to bars or going to, for a brief time there, 19 in Texas was legal, but there was also a bar we knew about that they didn't care how old you were. You didn't have to be 21 as long as you looked it. But anyway, getting way off this topic here, we would go to the movies and just do all this different things. Or to the arcades. We weren't going to each other's houses to play video games. So I didn't play a NES until Christmas of 1987. So a couple of years had gone by and I hadn't even played the NES yet. But what happened was, like I said, I didn't think I needed an NES because I was perfectly happy with ColecoVision and all these other systems. But my brother, of all people, got me an NES for Christmas of 1987. Now, I was blown away by that because, first of all, that's a parent level gift. And I was really shocked by that, that he got me an NES and with Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt. And that was so cool. And I had heard the NES was awesome, but actually playing Super Mario Brothers was an absolute revelation because every game that came before it, Super Mario Brothers was just such an advance in terms of just freedom of control, secrets and surprises, worlds, just the concept of all these different worlds. And there were some games, with multiple screens before it, like Adventure for the 2600, like Superman and Haunted House for the 2600. There were games with role-playing game elements and adventure elements and all that stuff before the NES. But Super Mario Brothers really, really advanced the whole industry in the US to the next level. And that was really mind-boggling to me. Here I am 20 years old in 1987, just a kid all over again, really excited about a new video game console. And I picked up, I proceeded to pick up a bunch of NES titles like Double Dragon and Contra and Ninja Gaiden. And as a matter of fact, I loved Contra. It came out in '88. I picked it up immediately. Box art looked cool. I thought it was a great game. And so I actually played it so much that I beat it without the Konami code because I didn't even know about that. That was before Nintendo Power in '88. I believe Nintendo Power came out in '89. I think that's when it debuted. But anyway, regardless, I didn't know about that code. And so I just played it and played it and played it and played it until I finally beat it with, your set number of lives. And that was great. And Legend of Zelda, I absolutely loved. And I'm not even a big RPG fan, but that game just sort of took everything to a next level. And it was so action oriented. I loved it. And I tolerated the, occasionally getting lost or, the RPG elements and stuff. But it was a great game. Metroid, I don't particularly like. Usually non-linear games make me a little crazy because I get lost or whatever, but I love Metroid. Castlevania 3, and all that stuff. And then I progressed on to, in 1989, I remember the Sega Genesis coming out because I was working at Lone Star Comics, this big comic book chain in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They had 8 stores, and I started out, bagging comic books and worked my way up to manager and everything. And in 1989, huge year for pop culture. Tell me in the comment, tell me what was so great about 1989 other than the Sega Genesis? Little Mermaid came out that restarted, got Disney sort of brought them into the mainstream again. What else was in 1989? I believe Nirvana's first album was in 1989. Just an amazing year for popular culture. Well, the Sega Genesis hit in 1989. The Simpsons debuted on TV in 1989. And I was actually, so when I was working at Lone Star, my coworkers were telling me the Sega Genesis was awesome, and they were really infatuated with, impressed by Altered Beast. Yes, Game Boy. Thank you for that, Michael. Just an incredible year for popular culture, and I was great for me personally because I was working at Lone Star Comics, just this big hub of pop culture awesomeness. And people kept telling me, Altered Beast, you've got to see it. It looks so much better than anything on the NES, and this is a great console. It's just the games are cool and awesome. It's so much cooler than the NES. But I held off because I'm usually a late adopter. I'll wait till a price break because I've been a game collector for years and years at this point. I had no shortage of games to play, but I was intrigued by the Genesis, but I waited. When Sonic came out in 1991, that's what pushed me over to get a Genesis. And I think I paid probably 150 for I got a new Sega Genesis, and I've got it at a certain price point, price drop. I believe it was $150 by this point. And I loved Sonic the Hedgehog, especially Sonic the Hedgehog 2. I just couldn't believe how fast the Genesis was. And Sonic, actually, for a time there, I remember people being down on Mario, because Super Nintendo came out in '91, and I didn't get my Super Nintendo until '92, I believe. And I remember people criticizing Super Mario World, which is an amazing game that you hardly ever hear anybody criticize now. But I remember some people saying that Super Mario World was just kind of stodgy and old-fashioned. It just seemed like the original Super Mario Brothers compared to Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega had those edgy ads. Sega does what Nintendo don't. And there was the blast processing and all that stuff. And so the Sega Genesis seemed like the cool console. And I sure bought into it. I loved it. And I still love the Genesis. Tons of great games on the Sega Genesis that I still play a lot to this day, like Truxton. And a few years later, I added a ton of boxed games to my Sega Genesis collection because FuncoLand, which eventually became GameStop around 2000, 2001 or something like that. FuncoLand, they had, once the later systems came out, like the PlayStation, the Nintendo 64, they were dumping the older stuff, and you could get tons of boxed Genesis games. This was before when FuncoLand, they would keep their manuals in boxes. They had big stores, plenty of room for all this stuff, and they wouldn't just throw everything away, and just put the cartridge out. They kept the boxes and manuals. And a lot of people kept their Genesis boxes because they're plastic and they were nice. A lot more Genesis boxes were kept than Nintendo. The Nintendo stuff, with the cardboard boxes, more people threw those away. So I amassed this really cool Genesis collection. And I remember getting Truxton for $2.99. I got Gunstar Heroes for $2.99 because there were just, games that are a lot more expensive now. So I amassed this great Genesis collection. And then it went on and on. got my Super Nintendo, like I said, '92. Once there was the first price drop, I got I was sold on the PlayStation. I didn't get one right away, but when they came out with those Namco Museum Classics collections, as far as I know, that was the first time you could play perfectly, emulated games at home because that was the original coding or whatever. And so I was, Namco Museum 1 through 5. That's what sold me on the PlayStation. That was a must get. And then on and on and on. I just, getting consoles since then. And 1997 really changed things. That's when the writing came into play. Now in 94, 95, I had tried to get a book published. It was going to be called Captain Cartridge Rates the Games. Now, there were very few video game books being published at the time. There were some. I mean, there were some mainstream Nintendo books. There were cheat and hint books. There were Nintendo books with just a set number of games. There weren't any comprehensive guides to Nintendo or anything like that. And I wanted to do a really big, you know, Leonard Maltin movie book style book about Genesis and Super Nintendo. This was '94. Those systems were, still viable. The PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were going to be coming out, but I figured, Genesis and Super Nintendo, and I was renting a whole bunch of games at Blockbuster. I was buying games at rental shops that were closing those out to make room for the newer systems, so I could just play them and then resell them. And I was just really working hard on a Sega Genesis Super Nintendo book called Captain Cartridge Rates the Games. Well, in '94, '95, it was really hard to find a publisher for video game books because most publishers were like, what? Video game book? Like they didn't even know that was a thing. And so I could not find a publisher. So that ultimately died. But in 1997, I got my brother in law, who I did a lot of gaming with back in the day, sent me a link to this was pretty early on with me using the internet, and it was '97. He sent me a link to the All Game Guide. This was this massive database whose objective was to have a synopsis and a review for every game, for every console, for every computer, for every arcade game, and the history of everything, all the way from the beginning up until the present at that time. And they would even send me new games to describe and review. And so, I sent them some writing samples. I got hired there, and I wrote for the All Game Guide extensively, so much so that I could quit my job at Walden Books. After I'd sold my comic book store in the early '90s, I had, after Lone Star Comics, me and my brother-in-law, who I just mentioned, opened their own comic book stores. We had 2 stores in the Fort Worth area. Well, after I sold my share to him, I started working at Walden Books, and I was really glad to get on with the All Game Guide because I had little kids at the time, and I was able to stay home with them and write from home, and that was awesome. And I became an editor with the All Game Guide, and I did a ton of work for them. And then they went in the early 2000s, after 9/11, they let their offsite writers go, and then they ultimately canceled the All Game Guide, and it went away completely. And I was working on a book project with them. They had a book project in the work where they were going to sort of have like physical versions of their online reviews and stuff. That went away, and I was really saddened by that. But years later, at the 2006 San Diego Comic-Con, now I'm getting fairly close to the end of my little talk here, and you guys are welcome to start asking questions or whatever in the comments. I'll be happy to answer what I can. And but anyway, so I get to 2006 San Diego Comic-Con. Now by this point, I had been writing for the Comics Buyer's Guide. I had written for a number of different magazines. In my writing career, I'd done the All Game Guide and all that stuff. I was doing pretty well with writing. And at the 2006 San Diego Comic-Con, I talked to a publisher there, McFarlane Publishers. And I asked him, said, hey, because McFarlane publishes, it doesn't have anything to do with Todd McFarlane. It's McFarland book publisher. And I talked to them about, just they do a lot of reference books for pop culture and for history and things like that. And I said, hey, if you guys ever need any help with any of your video game reference books, I didn't really know how the whole thing worked, let me know. And so I left the editor working there. She was manning the table. She was manning the table. That doesn't sound right. That's probably politically incorrect. She was working the table, and she she was really nice, but I was very surprised when I got home. 3 days after I got home, she emailed me and said, "Do you have any good book ideas?" I'm like, "Really? I've never written a book. I've written a lot, but I've never written a book." And so I sent back. I said, "Yeah, actually, I do have a good book idea. I wanted to continue what the All Game God was doing, but just do it myself." And so this led to Classic Home Video Games 1972 through 1984. This was my first book. This was published in 2007, and it covers the Atari 2600 and television, ColecoVision, all those great consoles, every US release for every system. This was the very first book to have full comprehensive coverage of Atari 5200, ColecoVision television, Vectrex, Microvision, Bally Astrocade, a write-up for every game for those consoles, including the Atari 2600. Now, Leonard Herman had beat me to the punch years earlier with the Atari, with ABC to the VCS, which was sort of a catalog of write-ups of every 2600 game. But this was the first book to have all the other systems. And then I continued that series with, the NES era and the Genesis era. And then I've got the Super Nintendo books here, the SNES Omnibus books. And it was interesting. So the Classic Home Video Game series, that was originally going to be one book. And it was going to cover everything from the original Magnavox Odyssey all the way up through the Super Nintendo, which came out in 91. It was going to cover that span. And it was just going to be a super brief, just a couple of sentences, really short paragraph about every game. Well, my publisher said, this is going to be a really, really good, really big book. This is going to be massive. So could you think of a way to divide it up somehow? And I thought, sure, I'll be happy to, because it would mean I would get another book published. And so I was really excited that they wanted more than one book from me. So I ended up doing 3 books and in the series. And it made for much more manageable write-ups, and they could be a little bit longer and everything. So anyway, that was the genesis of the Classic Home Video Game series. And that, like I said, that series began in 1997. And that's, 2007. 97 was the All Game Guide. And then a decade later, I started writing books. And that was right around the time that retro gaming started picking up. There weren't many retro gaming books on the market. There were a few, Ben Burnham's Supercade, and there were some others, but there weren't a ton of, Leonard Herman, of course, with Phoenix. And this was when retro gaming kind of started snowballing, kind of getting more popular. This is when the Classic Home Video Game series came out. This was when the Angry Video Game Nerd got popular on YouTube. The Wii Shop channel became a thing, and so people were playing, casual gamers were having access to older Nintendo games through the Wii. And so retro gaming really started, it's huge today and it's booming. There's all this homebrew stuff and just amazing. And it really took off around 2006, 2007, 2008. And that's when the Classic Home Video Games book series started. So if you guys have any questions at all about, writing or about getting published, about just sort of maybe some more of my experience with retro gaming. One thing I didn't mention, hey Marissa, how you doing? Hey Steve. Voltaire, very kind of you to say. So Michael Mertis says, as a Sega Genesis fan, what were your thoughts on the Sega CD and 32X when they came out? Did you pick either of them up? That's a great question. I remember really, really wanting the Sega CD. I thought the Filmation video, it obviously looks crude now. It even looked kind of crude then. But I was really excited about it. I thought it was great. As a matter of fact, one year, I thought my mother-in-law was getting me for that for Christmas for some reason. I don't know what it got in my head. I don't know why I thought that. But I just kind of thought she was. But she didn't. She always got me great presents, but that wasn't it. But I did find at a garage sale of all things, what I called a triple-decker. A Genesis or a Sega D system, excuse me, it was a Sega DC, Sega CD, Sega Genesis, and Sega 32X stacked on top of each other, a triple decker. And I got that at a garage sale, so I had all 3 systems. I don't know why they would sell that. It was just an incredible setup. So I did have all 3, but it was after. I remember seeing stacks of 32Xs being dumped for $10 each after those was a failure. And I remember the Sega CD when it came out was like $230 and as an attachment. I remember wishing Sega would have come out with just another complete console instead of these add-ons. I thought 32X wasn't enough of an upgrade, and I thought that was kind of ridiculous to have this expensive add-on. I think it was, I don't even remember what it was, uh, how expensive it was, but it seemed really expensive for not much of an upgrade over Genesis, and a downgrade in some cases. The Genesis itself had so many more great games, and the 32X was just really a failure. But I remember wanting the CD, the Sega CD, more than anything. And I still love the Sega CD, Lethal Enforcers, and Sonic CD, and a number of games on that. And so yeah, I did get the Sega CD and 32X eventually. I just thought they were overpriced, and I would have rather had maybe just something like the Saturn right away instead of two little stopgap measures before a whole nother console. Thank you, Michael, for that. Charles Cook asks, did you play in the Blockbuster Championship? I did not. I remember hearing something about it, but I just didn't make the effort to. I remember in Dallas, that was a big thing in Dallas. Thor Ackerland, I believe, was at the Dallas, uh, and I just didn't get involved in it for whatever reason. 1990, 91, around that time, I was just, I was still gaming. And I remember the explosion, Street Fighter 2 in the arcades in the early 90s. And like I told you guys, I was still playing a lot of console games in the early 90s. But I just didn't make the effort to do anything organized like that. And that kind of reminds me of the early 80s, when game tournaments were a thing. But now, unlike the early 90s, where I sort of knew about the championships, I didn't even know in the early 80s there was such thing as gaming tournaments. There was a big Texas video game tournament with, Ben Gold, a Dallas guy. I didn't know anything about any of those. I had mastered asteroids. I could play asteroids for hours and hours and hours just on one quarter. And I could have been an asteroids world champion, but I had no idea competitive gaming existed at all. Joe Toledo, or I think I'm Toledo, is there a good first step to take for aspiring writers trying to get published? That's a great question. You'll want to, the obvious answer, what everybody says, read a lot, of course, and all that, write a lot, of course. But what you really want to do is you want to Google search writer's guidelines, and you'll want to go to Barnes and Noble or Books a Million or whatever bookstore you have. You'll want to look at the different, who is publishing the type of book you want to, like if there's a particular genre you have in mind, if you're wanting to write science fiction books, or if the genre of preference is video games or horror, look for the publishers that are publishing that type of material, and see what which publishers publish the kind of stuff you want to write about. Then get online and Google their writer's guidelines. Most websites for publishers will have their guidelines, what you need to do to submit material to them. And what you'll want to do is you'll want to email them. First, you tell them your idea, then you tell them who you are. When you email the publisher, they don't care who you are. They care about your idea. If they like your idea, then they'll care who you are. So you want one paragraph telling them your idea for a book or article. This applies to magazines too, newspapers, websites, whatever. You want to tell them your idea, and then in the second paragraph, you want to tell them who you are. Keep it simple, keep it punchy, let someone else read it. Contact the publishers that way. Michael Murtis, did you ever experience writer's block? What do you do to refocus? That's a good question. As a writer's block is, to me, it's more of a thing with fiction writers. You just can't come up with any new ideas, and you sort of get stuck on, what should the characters do next? With nonfiction, it's a little different. Now, I wrote some fiction mostly in the 90s, and I would have writer's block from time to time. And the way to do it, I would just put it down, and I would go exercise. I would drive somewhere. I'd take my dogs out on my bicycle, and then just come back to it the next day, something like that. So just get away from it and come back. With nonfiction, writer's block is really not a problem for me because there's always stuff to write about. And I'm always under the gun with deadlines, either through the newspaper. For over a decade, I wrote for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. I've written for a bunch of different magazines, and you have to turn in copy. You're turn in your writing. You have a deadline, so I would just power through it. And sometimes I get like in a little bit of a melee, just kind of a not feeling it, Caffeine works for me every time with nonfiction. Jeffrey Wittenhagen, a fellow author. If you were talking video games, shoot myself or okay, gotcha. Jeff, known me for many years. Yeah, Jeff, I've known you since I believe the Iowa event back in 2014. Very awesome. And I'll hit you up, Jeff, on a DM. That's cool. Thanks for checking out the panel, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Michael, Joe, everybody, Charles. Anybody else have any questions? One thing I didn't cover was in the early 90s, I discovered video game fandom. Now, video game fandom, that was in the early 90s, you didn't really hear much about retro gaming. You know, that you concentrated on the new systems, but there were still people playing Atari in the early 90s. I just hardly knew anybody that did it until I discovered the Digital Press fanzine, the Slapdash fanzine, and some online forums. Michael, what was the worst game you played that you had to write about? Castlevania 2 doesn't count. Oh, there are far worse games than Castlevania 2 that I've had to write about. Well, one particularly painful game I wrote about, and I've mentioned this one before, is Hide Lied for the Nintendo NES. This is a dreadful role-playing game, clumsy gameplay, small characters. And it was funny. I don't know why I bought Hide Lied. It must have been on a discount or something because I knew it was a role-playing game, and that's not my favorite genre. But for some reason, I bought it. It must have been dirt cheap, but it was new. Probably got it at Toys R Us, and it was just a dreadful game. And I powered through enough of it that I could just to write about it, but then put it down. And I played it some more with the NES Omnibus, but holy cow. As a matter of fact, I traded it to a guy for the Uncanny X-Men for the NES, which was just about as bad, but the box art at least is cool in the X-Men game. Steve Lynn, love your stuff. Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. 8-bit Steve, nice of you to say. And Michael says, I feel you on Hide Lied. That was a weekend rental. I still regret. Hey, at least you didn't buy it. But I did get to trade it, and the box art for the Uncanny X-Men is awesome. And if you're collecting games, you know how important box art is. You know what looks cool on your shelf. And but anyway, so in the early 90s, I discovered video game fandom, and a lot of it mirrors, comic book fandom. Kind of took off in the early 60s when people discovered that, people that were reading what are now Silver Age comics from the 60s, they discovered there were fans of comic books from the 30s and 40s. And similarly, in the early 90s, people like me discovered that there were people interested in video games from the 70s and 80s. And that was really a revelation to read these fanzines. And the fanzine addresses were published in the back of video game magazines, like Electronic Gaming Monthly and stuff. They would publish, that's getting real early. They would publish, I think even Game Pro, anyway, regardless, certain video game magazines would publish fanzines addresses and comments. And I remember Arnie Katz really doing it, I think later regardless, it was really cool to discover fanzines. And the ones I remember in particular are Digital Press published by Joe Santulli, Slapdash by Russ Perry, Atari 2600 Connection, I believe it was Tim Duarte and then Russ Perry. So it was very cool to read these early fanzines. Some pretty good video game writing. They were just pieces of paper stapled together, but it was so cool to discover, that there were other people that played video games. And it was another interesting thing was eBay. When I started selling stuff on eBay in the late 90s, I was shocked that some of those early games for ColecoVision, Atari 2600, that they were worth a little bit of money, especially in the box with the manual. Because up until that time, video games were pretty much considered junk before eBay. Retro games, older games, in the 90s, you could get, I would go with my parents to garage sales, just ride along with them, just something I could, as an adult child of my parents, just something we could do together, since I was no longer a kid and under their watch and everything, something we could do together, just kind of as a family. I didn't want to, just because I was an adult and moved out of the house and everything, I didn't want to, I still wanted to hang out with my parents, great folks. We would go to garage sales together, and I would come back with literally bags and boxes and stacks of gaming stuff. Most of this, I've got thousands and thousands of games. The majority of them were from garage sales, and the video game crash. So I've got a big collection, but relatively speaking, I paid pennies on the dollar for it. And a lot of it was just because in the 90s, before eBay, and even early eBay, you could still games that are now, worth thousands or hundreds. They might have been worth $20 or $30. Some of the rare stuff, or Coleco or Atari or whatever. But I remember, I mean, before that, so much of the stuff was junk. I'm getting close to 2,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel. And I think for my 2,000th episode, as a matter of fact, you can go to, if you, on YouTube, if you just look under Brett Weiss, I'd appreciate the sub. That'd be awesome. Getting really close to, I think I'm like three away from 2,000 today, which is crazy. Getting that close. I've just been doing YouTube seriously for a little over a year, having fun with that. But anyway, before, eBay and all this kind of stuff, in the 90s, these older games were just considered junk. And for my next episode, my 2,000 subscriber episode, I want to do the big mistake I made in the 80s. The second biggest mistake. The first biggest mistake I made was passing up a bunch of Game and Watches that were some warehouse find at GameStop in like 2001 or so. And that was back when GameStop would put out older stuff that were just random factory sealed stuff sometimes from older stock. I threw away a whole bunch of stuff for a particular thing that I'll tell you about in this episode. But yeah, so much video game, the early stuff was just not in the 90s. Most people, once they got the new console, would put the old system in the garage sale or at the flea market. And I remember so many times at thrift stores, flea markets, you could just, in the early 90s, you could walk by, oh, there's a Rob from, Nintendo Robot. There's a Power Glove. I've already got one of those. It might be $5. There's a Rob. It's $8. I don't need that. I don't want it because it works crappy. I remember with stacking and all that stuff. It's just not a good game peripheral. It doesn't work well, so I don't want it. Might get it just because it looks cool on your shelf, but all that stuff was just considered junk. You could find Atari cartridges, Nintendo NES cartridges for a quarter, 50 cents, $1 a piece. Just it was a great. The 90s were the golden age of garage selling, game chasing, and I was right in it. It was so much fun. All right, guys, we've got a few minutes left if anybody has any more questions. If not, the NES Omnibus, my forthcoming book, will be out in December, and it is currently on Indiegogo. Now, the reason it's over there is because it's just a simple way to extend pre-orders. That way you can still get a signed book with some backer bonuses. And the book had a successful run on Kickstarter. And I didn't even know you could. I'm new to Kickstarter as well, as far as, I'm pretty new to YouTube a little over a year, but I just recently backed my first Kickstarter campaign a few months ago. And the NES Omnibus was my first Kickstarter. And it went really well. I was really excited about that. And the NES Omnibus Volume 2 will be on Kickstarter as well. And I just did Indiegogo because it's just a way to move over pre-orders. It's a better way to get your book recognized than just if it was on my own website, which it is also as well. All right, guys, I guess if you don't have any more questions, you got a couple more minutes. If anybody has any, I appreciate the questions. I appreciate you guys watching. It's been great being able to do YouTube, and I've even been doing TikTok videos, which is kind of free. There is a retro gaming contingent on TikTok. It's not all just about silly girls dancing to canned music or whatever. There's some pretty cool stuff on TikTok if you want to check that out as well. All right, so Michael Mertis says, with so many options to play classic video games, what is your preference on how to revisit them? Well, I've got a big game room upstairs with original hardware, original cartridges, original controllers. That's the way I like to do it, although I love my arcade collections, my arcade compilations on my 360, on my PS1 and my PS2. Those are awesome, really great. But I definitely prefer the original hardware and all that. And I really don't. I've got a CollectorVision Phoenix on order. I'm really excited to play ColecoVision on that. On the modern TV setup. I'll be really curious what that's like. I'm looking forward to the Amico. But as far as playing the old games, I like the original hardware. Michelle Bridges says, thank you for telling the story of your gaming history. Very entertaining. Well, thank you, Michelle. That's very nice of you to say. And scroll up a little bit. All right, guys. So let's see. A couple more minutes. If anybody has anything. Like I said, I just really missed out on shows this year. I've done so many great shows. Portland Retro Gaming Expo. Done that 3 years in a row. I was so looking forward to going to Portland this year. Such a beautiful city. Mo GameCon I did for the first time last year. That was a ton of fun. That was a blast. Classic Game Fest in Austin. Technically, it's still a go in the middle of October, but I don't look for it happening. He says it's going to happen, possibly. He's going to, David Kalin, who runs Classic Game Fest, Awesome guy. He says Classic Game Fest is ready to go. I believe it's October 11th and 12th or something like that. And September 10th, he's going to make an announcement whether it's officially going to be canceled or not. Michael Mertis, what is your favorite part about attending game conventions? Man, there's so many aspects of it. I absolutely love seeing. There are some people that are good friends of mine that are going to be friends of mine for life that I only see at gaming conventions. That's probably the best. Just seeing friends, and I love making finds. Like at Retropalooza one year, a guy had Up and Down for the Atari 2600, a rare Atari 2600 game, under the table in a big box of stuff. He mostly carried NES to the present. He was a store owner that had a booth at Retropalooza. I said, "How much is this Atari game?" He goes, "Well, we don't really do Atari in the store. Just name me a price." It was complete in the box. And I said, "I don't know, $10." And so, sure, that's about a $350 game complete in the box. So I love the big finds. I love hanging out with friends. I like seeing people I don't see every year. And sometimes the most fun is away from the convention, like Portland last year, at the hotel bar, with a bunch of some fellow authors and fellow YouTubers was just an absolute blast. Just so much fun. All right, guys, I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for watching. Again, if you just want to go to brettweisswords.com, that will have links to direct sales for all my books, has a link to my YouTube channel, and all that good stuff. So just brettweisswords.com, as you can see on my banner here. And anyway, thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. And y'all have an awesome rest of this virtual convention. And thanks, Ryan, for having me out. It's been it's been fun talking to you guys, and I've enjoyed watching some of the other panels as well. All right, guys, we will talk to you later.